Welcome to Signals and Stories, 10 Years with the Vertex Project, a limited series exploring how cyber threat intelligence has evolved over the past decade. In each episode, we break down how analysts actually investigate, covering the data and the decisions that shape real-world intelligence. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome to our limited series. We are doing 10 episodes to represent 10 years of the Vertex Project since it opened its doors. I'm Callie Fencl, and today I'm sitting down with the co-founders of the Vertex Project, Visi and John Rodgers, aka Whippit. And in this episode, we're going to talk about cyber threat intelligence, aka CTI, and their thoughts on what it was supposed to be versus what it's become, and any gaps that exist within the discipline. I've already got Visi.
Not that we have any opinions on that or anything, right?
I chose the topic that I was like, oh yeah, they're definitely going to have some opinions on this. Well, maybe before we begin, would you like to introduce yourselves to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. Yeah, it's a little impromptu, but I'm Visi Stark, one of the co-founders of the Vertex Project. Whippit and I go back a very long ways to having worked together over the course of several jobs and decided to punch out from Mandiant from back in the day. So our team is the little team that kind of dreamt up and authored the APT1 report. Back then, we used to work in offense, both like R&D and operations for the U.S. intelligence community. So we've got a long history in the space. I also won DEF CON CTF a number of years ago, and then like a lot of years ago, and then eventually founded the group that ran DEF CON CTF for a few years. So we've been around.
Yeah, I guess like Visi said, we have a lot of shared history at this point, a couple of decades worth, I think at this point. So that's insane to say out loud. But yeah, I mean, it's been quite the ride. So I'm glad we're here. It's hard to imagine that we're 10 years into this part of it. So
100%. Yeah.
Gotcha. Excellent. So, to start, when we say cyber threat intelligence, are we actually talking about intelligence? Like, can intelligence and cyber threat intelligence be used interchangeably? Like, what are your thoughts about the
God, I hope so. I mean, so ultimately,
vocab of it all.
Yeah. So I think that ultimately, the term CTI ends up limiting the scope a little too much for the impact that could be had by the discipline, the analysts, and the data that they have access to, and the problems that they could be solving. In modern understanding, people have started to allow that scope to creep a little bit. But essentially, the higher, the more things that you have inside of that definition, the more things you can have impact on. And so I think that there has been a little bit of a battle, a little bit of a slow moving process to redefine that to potentially, include things that are traditionally outside the scope of like cyber or maybe even threat intelligence.
Yeah, I guess my only addition there, I would guess that in most cases, Visi and I are on the same page. And I think my only, take on it in addition to that is that, the intelligence part's in there, right? It's in the term. And so it didn't end up there by accident. But to Visi's point though, it did get kind of pigeonholed, right? It got constrained by the first bit. But as our lives continue to be more intertwined, right, the cyber part kind of becomes more pivotal there. So yeah, it's definitely not as big as it could be.
Well, and I think you probably allude to this. I might be jumping the gun because I did actually scan your outline, right? But one of the things that sort of gave birth to CTI as a formal discipline in the private sector is a bunch of people, with history in the actual government services, public sector, actual intel, punching out into the private sector and being like, hey, listen, how can we use these skills that we've gained, right? And so even a lot of those ideas like holistic intelligence analysis and things like that were sort of there originally and then have been scoped out as over the course of a few years of the field defining itself. And I think we need to be sure to scope those back in or continue to include them where they're appropriate. So.
Yeah, and on the history side, right, I think that's a good point of saying hey, the government was doing something, right, on the in kind of a traditional intelligence, right, and it happened to include this type of data, right, if you want to call it that. And
all source.
Yeah, it was a particular type of data, right, and so And then, there was a commercial need though, right? Where they're like, we have problems, right? And like, who are the people that know how to do this stuff? And so I think that's kind of where that's where it came from, I think. So that's fair.
Yeah.
So coming back to my outline, because you've admitted to our audience that we have a little bit of an outline going on.
I mean, I think that anybody who, is familiar with the production process knows that you would probably have an outline in order to keep us on track, because otherwise Whippet and I would probably end up down rabbit holes that are not interesting.
I want you to go down rabbit holes, so
And maybe they'll be interesting.
Maybe.
and we'll see what comes out of it. But yes, if
Yeah.
you wanted to go down a rabbit hole, like, yeah, we'll fix it in post. Like,
Sure.
so, coming back to my questions, how do you think automation changed the role of the analyst? Like, what
Sure.
what would your thoughts be on that?
I mean, I think it continues to change, right? Like in the beginning, there was a lot of very manual process, a lot of data janitoring. Actually, we kind of call it internally, right? Where basically it's, manual collation, manual fusing, right, of data from multiple sources and things like that. And like classic like ETL pipelines and things like that kind of came along, and platforms like Synapse came along that are designed to do that sort of data fusion. And at least some of those parts got a bit more automated, but there's definitely still more things that can be automated. And then there's also instances where people are, I think, are trying to automate some of the wrong things, right? So speaking of, rabbit holes and hot button issues, but there are a lot of instances where I see organizations try to over adopt, like they try to assume that automation can do things that are magic, right? And
Mhm.
so like if you can't think about how the system is going to perform that operation, in like without you, then you probably shouldn't be asking it to perform that operation, right? And so like nothing should be magic, because in intelligence it's extremely important that any assessments that come out, right, are actionable but also decomposable. And so that you can basically take them back to the person who made that assessment to be like, why did we make this decision, or why did you make this assessment, so that it's defensible, right, when decision makers have to go and do something that's either unpopular or costly, or things like that.
Yeah, I think to your point, Visi, about it, the automating everything, right? And there's like a like, oh, I just want to kind of wave my hands and push the automation button and it's done. And yeah, you have to think through it, and you really do have to kind of really what you're doing is you're codifying your internal logic that you're going through. And
Yep.
I think that's probably the biggest. I think the other part is prioritization. There's a little bit of it's almost overwhelming sometimes, I think, for our customers, especially to like,
Definitely.
what do I automate first? And
Right.
so going through that process, because it does cost you something to automate it, right? Because you are thinking through it and you're spending the time to test it and all of that. So,
Yeah. You remember that cost recouping, like time recouping table that we used to have, like literally
yeah.
like in the layer back in
I
the
mean, there's
Mandiant days. We used to have it
yeah.
like on a poster or something.
I
It
mean,
was
there's the
basically like,
XKCD for it, right?
oh yeah, is there? Yeah, it's basically.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, maybe there was. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was basically like a mapping of like, if you do this X times a day and it takes you this long and it takes you this amount of time to automate it, you're never going to recoup that time, or it'll take you 2.5 years of continually doing that to recoup that time. So we adopt a little bit of that strategy when we're considering what to work on first and what to automate first, because we need to make sure that we're working on the right stuff. And I think that a lot of organizations do fall into some of those traps where they think that because they could automate something that they should. And there are times when that's true, for sure, like 100%. But then there are also times when they end up kind of overlooking the forest for the trees and end up automating something that doesn't have a good return, for the time that it takes to automate it, versus them having automated something else, right? And so, like, nowhere is that more clear, honestly, than with the modern, use of AIs and LLMs and stuff like that. In a lot of instances, there are things that it could be doing for them, and it could be doing really, really well. And some organizations have adopted a strategy of divide and conquer, and define the pieces that you want it to do and have it do some of those things. But other orgs tend to just try to like hand it like the big problem and be like, solve this. And that's not a real good use case for automation. And then they end up kind of drowning in all of the edge cases that the answer to that produces. So
I guess, like, just, like, from a timeline perspective, like, so we're looking at the past 10 years. How did, like, what were your impressions of what automation was like 10 years ago versus, like, what it's become now? Like, how did
yeah.
we get to where we are with automation in those 10 years?
Yeah. So I mean, like the classic ETL pipelines that we were talking about definitely already existed back then, right? What was that one? Whippit, do you remember what was the name of that tool that the DARPA cats were super hot on for a while? Something
Was it
flow.
NiFi?
Oh yeah, NiFi. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and there was another one too that was something flow or whatever, and it was basically the ability to like visually drag and drop. Like this data pumps into this thing and then gets transformed
Yeah.
like this, and then gets pumped into this other thing. That all pre-existed, right? Like data automation has been sort of the nature of the game since computers, right?
Mhm.
But essentially the adoption of more advanced like enrichment strategies, right? Fusion platforms and things like that, especially, I mean, that's what we're shooting for at building Synapse, right? Is a platform that everybody can use to automate ingesting data from all those various data sources and creating a single, kind of picture of their known, like analytically relevant universe. So.
Yeah, I guess when I think about it more from the perspective of abstraction, right? And so, like to Visi's point, like these ETL pipelines have been around for a long time, right? That's nothing. It's not novel 10 years ago. But I think through more kind of graph-based languages like Storm, right? Obviously, we're going to talk about ours because we have it.
Right. Yeah.
But
Sure.
the analysts can actually express themselves at an abstraction layer more analytically, I would say, right? More closer to the way that they think about it, which allows their actual analysis to be automated
Yeah.
in a more,
Yeah.
what's the word,
And
rich,
that
I
brings
guess,
up an
way.
edge case that is like that, I think is important too, is like everybody always asks like, I want to be able to ask something in natural language, right? But
Mhm.
like natural language isn't precise. It's like by its own nature, it's imprecise. There's a lot of instances of needing to interpret things. I mean, just look at how commonly people misunderstand each other and get in fights and stuff like that, right? Like, do you really want, that to be the basis for your query language? And so one of the things that we focused on when we were building Storm was syntactically simple, or at least for simple use cases, right? Syntactically simple, but still maintaining the level of precision that's necessary to be able to ask and answer a question and know that you're getting back the exact thing that you want, right? And so, like, if that were to be natural language, there'd be a lot of wiggle room in there, or you'd need to there have been projects actually out there that have attempted to codify natural language in a way that's a subset of natural language that you could use to program systems and things like that. And it basically involves removing all ambiguity and removing all pronouns and removing all, things like that. And so the language ends up just very stilted. And by the time you get to the point where you're defining something like that, you might as well have just used a terse, DSL, a terse programming language that's designed for that purpose. So like we used to say that we tried to make Storm initially be syntactically more like YAML and less like JSON, right? Like JSON data feels very programmery, but YAML feels a little bit more intuitively understandable, right? You don't need to quote strings if they're simple, and numbers are just numbers, right? And ta-da.
So is CTI expected to operate at a specific speed or cadence? And if so, can intelligence actually be done at that speed?
There's a loaded question if I've ever heard one. Yeah, go ahead, Whippet. Like, looks
Yeah,
like
I
you.
mean, that's tough. I mean, of course, right? And I think that's probably one of the kind of unspoken dimensions of intelligence analysis is time, right? You wouldn't, given enough time, you can accomplish almost anything, right? But very clearly, within intelligence, right? Intelligence has a shelf life in general, and so the timelines in which you can create that intelligence matter, and obviously the effort involved. And so,
Yeah. And
yes,
then
the
and then the
answer.
time to deliver, the time that it takes to get that across to leadership and things like that is
Yeah, there's
all
all
has to
kinds
be a
of
part of the
slices
time.
of time.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Sorry, I
so,
don't.
and no, that, and then the other, the other component is like, like what, briefly mentioned, right? Resources become an issue because again, like if we all had all the time in the world to like head off into a corner and groom this little threat cluster, this little subgraph that we really love, right? My old dear buddies, APT5 or some of the other ones like that I've loved back in the day, APT8, right? Like I would love to have that be, the thing that I can do for a living, right? But ultimately, the production output requirements are that I'm providing, sufficient context and assessments to decision makers or decision making systems. And like I think another rabbit hole, but we need to also make sure to include within the scope of decision makers just about anybody who's making a decision who could be informed by intelligence. We tend to think of decision makers as executives, but it turns out a SOC analyst who's saying ignore that alert is making a decision, and that
Mhm.
decision being informed by assessments that can be decomposed is super important. But so ultimately, kind of popping the stack frame back to what I was talking about before, the resources involved in doing that, one could sit and tool around on a threat cluster that they love forever, but we all don't have time. Nobody's got time for that shit. And so like ultimately then we end up with analysts needing to triage, and
Mhm.
so that basically creates a forcing function where they have to decide what to work on and what to let slip past, because in the current state of affairs, there is always more shit to do than time to do it.
Mhm.
Always, 100% of the time. I don't know of a single team, using Synapse or not, that is like, well, we don't know what to do with all this time we've got, right? So
Just have scads of time available.
yeah, I mean, we would all just go sailing and hit the win button, right? Like that's what we used to say back in the day. So
Yeah, I mean, I think just to go back to the time bit, I think it's again, it's something that's mostly really explicitly stated, but it comes out as a matter of efficiency and automation. There's an understanding, right,
right,
that it needs to be done as soon as possible because there, like to Busy's point, there is always more to do, and so then it comes about like then it kind of shifts towards like, well, how are we prioritizing,
Mhm.
right, and
right,
what does it cost us to prioritize, and how do we do that effectively and efficiently,
right.
So
Yeah,
there's
and
time there too. And
that all
then
leads
and
back to the
then
time trade off, right? Yeah,
right. And then how well in the how well are we, to Busy's point about communicating to um, decision makers?
Yeah.
There's different variants on those. And so if I'm the analyst, right, producing intelligence, right, how, what systems how am I communicating it differently to the SOC analyst versus to the executive to make sure that they understand my meaning?
right.
Mhm.
And so all of
Yep.
the tooling around that as well,
And
and
do
the
they have the
time
ability
associated
to
with that.
decompose that meaning themselves? Do they have, do they need to read a big block of prose in order to get to the thing that they're actually interested in, right? Just all of those issues that cause that time dilation to happen, right? The interpretation takes time, convincing them takes time, all of that. And so basically the time boxed nature of intel analysis needs to include all the way through to the person that's making a decision actually making that decision.
Yeah. When have you gotten value from that intelligence, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so
It
like one of
needs
the
to
things that we
include all the
stress.
way to there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so one of the things that we stress to analysts pretty regularly is, if your message isn't landing, it's on you. That's like our job as analysts to convey our findings in a way that our consumer, our decision maker, our whatever, can consume it and can act on it. And so in some instances, analysts will occasionally be like, oh, I have to dumb it down and whatever, but like that's your job, right? Like that's your actual job, is to make sure that it's understandable and digestible to whoever your target decision maker is. And so again, like back to the example of a SOC analyst and things like that, it might be a highly technical person that just needs the context and the links out to other things that are linked in a subgraph, programmatically, and doesn't need prose or explanation or any, quote unquote handholding and stuff like that. But on the other end, you've got, executives that have an entirely other body of knowledge and expertise, right? Like they're not going to be technical experts, although I am hoping that we eventually do see executive positions and executive leadership be a little bit more aware of the intelligence process and things like that. But ultimately, it's on us to make sure that that message lands.
And that's something too, Visi, that I know like you and I have discussed like off camera is analysts needing to take that responsibility of communicating their findings, but sometimes I don't know if it's, we might call it imposter syndrome or,
Sure.
yeah, or just like
I mean, almost nowhere is imposter syndrome worse than it is in analysts, right?
really.
And oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. So like ultimately it actually almost all boils back to how easily measured, how good are the metrics, right? And so like with developers, for example, there are more easy metrics. It's a little bit like the AI and LLM stuff, right? Where like the code either works or it doesn't, right? And it's either a trimmed down kind of smooth, like clearly elegant implementation, or it's not. With intelligence analysis, it's a lot more nebulous. Trying to measure whether or not a person has put out something that was excellent or not can be really tough, because it also involves a certain amount of statistical probability, right? Likelihood. And so like if I say that something is likely twice in a row and it doesn't happen both times, does that mean I'm a bad analyst, or does that mean we got lucky twice, right?
Mhm.
And so like that, that makes it very, very difficult to measure. And things that are more difficult to measure are going to be more, internalized. And then also, obviously, I know a lot of analysts, are very type A and very detail oriented, and that also kind of lends itself to being, to having imposter syndrome and stuff like that. So the little message that I would give is I occasionally feel imposter syndrome in intelligence analysis. So if I'm capable of feeling it, everyone should be, right?
You heard it here
And
first.
and that's okay.
Feels imposter syndrome.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for coming to my imposter syndrome TED talk. Right.
Yeah, I
Um,
guess the only thing I would add there is that I think it's true of all people, right? On some level,
mhm.
right? At some point. And so, yeah, it's just part of the, to Vizzy's point in terms of like human psychology and whatever. I guess
Well,
we're,
and especially like,
yeah,
intelligent people that are going to be introspective and things like that, right? Which like that's definitely what you want in an analyst. So.
yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to come back to something that you both had mentioned earlier about the people in the room that analysts are speaking to. They might be technical, they might be leadership, they might be SOC analysts. How do people know if they qualify as part of like the decision makers that analysts are bringing that information to? Is that something that's always known, or how?
No.
Yeah, how do people stand up for themselves and say like I should be part of this conversation. I have skin in the game.
Yeah. I mean, the real challenge there is it does ultimately need to kind of flow from the top down. Like you can't really induce that culture at least in a large organization. It's really difficult to induce that culture if it doesn't have buy-in from leadership, right?
Mhm.
But I think that there's a fairly self-evident argument to be made that like my workflow, my process involves making decisions, right? And those decisions could be better informed. And that's kind of the basics of that argument at almost any level.
Yeah, and then it's a matter of, okay, where can I be better informed from, right? Within my org, right? And
Right.
then, but at that point, it's very much a proactive, like you're almost looking for it at that point if I don't
Yep.
already know about it. I would say
Yeah.
on the other side, we do see our customers where they'll start in one spot and then it will start to kind of spread within the organization in
Yep.
terms of use, just because it is useful, right? And
Right.
so I think the biggest, I don't know, I guess win we see, right, is when they are, being efficient and they're being productive, right? And then other orgs or that are adjacent that are already, maybe connected in some other way, say, hey, maybe can I get some of that too? Or can I help?
Yeah.
And maybe
Yeah.
we can help each other. I think that's
A
where
little
we
bit of
see it
like
as well.
a little bit of FOMO based scope creep kind of thing
A
and
little
stuff
bit.
like that. Yeah. I mean, I tell a story fairly regularly about one of our customers. I can sufficiently genericize it so that it's not identifiable, but essentially they were tracking some additional data. They were ingesting some data into their Synapse instance for their own use, for their own intelligence purposes, right? But the data model is relatively universal and the query language is flexible. And a call sort of came down from on high from the executives, and they were literally like, we need to answer this question about our organization and we can't. Who inside of our organization is well positioned to answer this question? Can anybody come up with an answer to this? And they were just like, beep, boop, bop, here's the answer, because like they had been codifying some of that data again for a totally unrelated purpose. And once they, then basically the eye of Sauron, right? The executive leadership is like, how did you do that? Right? Like we had this as an intractable problem and, you just push button the answer and I got a, message back or whatever. And so then they started getting additional resources and things like that. So one of the things that I've used that, to convey to people is it's worthwhile to attempt to engage with someone laterally, potentially on a one-off basis to prove the concept, to show like, hey, listen, like we made this decision and it was better or faster or had a better outcome in this one instance where we tried this in an unofficial capacity. So we should make it a little bit more official or formalize that relationship a little bit more. And in some instances, that actually just is the process of recognizing intelligence functions happening in other parts of the company, right? And that kind of gets back to the whole like CTI is overscoped, blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, there are little pockets inside of organizations that are doing intelligence work that are spread all over the place. And like, what kind of force multiplier could it be if a lot of them are working, in the same way, from the same space, from the same data, and being able to like view each other's assessments and stuff. So
Do you think people are real?
not that I have a soapbox issue there or anything either, right? But
It's a podcast. The whole thing is a soapbox.
yeah, I know, right? I'll get used to it. Don't worry.
Yeah, good. Do you think, when you say like pockets of people are doing intelligence across the organization, do you think that they're doing intelligence work without realizing it?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I think that so like some of the use cases are fairly self-evident where you've got, the CTI team literally has intelligence in their name, right? But like the financial fraud analysis teams, right? If they came out of government and were doing like, like fin fraud or follow the money criminal analysis and things like that, they probably understand that it's intelligence function. But I've definitely seen organizations that are doing, identity-based intelligence analysis or financial, even forensic accounting, that they're not tied in with the CTI team, or they're not recognized as being a part of an intelligence process as acutely. And then that even gets out into other things where you've got, things like hiring managers and HR and even marketing, right? Like in a lot of instances, those are attempting to carve signal out of noise and down select subsets of data and activity to attribute. Even oftentimes, like attribution is the name of the game in a lot of those other disciplines too. And so I think that there's a lot of room for organizations to realize that all of those are very similar functions, right? So I sort of classically say that it's like secretly technical targeting from the old school intelligence offense perspective, and CTI attribution and marketing are all basically the same discipline
I like that. That's cool.
with a different outcome, but
Right. Of course. Do you think that we are asking CTI analysts to do intelligence work without giving them the proper space to actually do it?
there's another great softball. Love it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Go ahead with it.
Yeah, I mean, sure, I'll take that one first. Yes and yes, I guess, right? I mean, if we go back to the time bit, right? Analysts are under significant pressure to produce, right? And to get through the literally, as we stated before, impossible pile of things to do. And so, of course not. They are never getting the space they need to do it. And so they are not only being asked to do their jobs, but they're also being asked to evaluate new tools to do them with and determine their efficacy and whether or not they should be implemented, right? And then implement them while they continue to produce
Right.
and produce intelligence. So,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean,
That actually
that's the
touches on
shortest version of that answer, I think.
something that we use as a mantra pretty regularly, which is, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right?
Mhm.
And so, like, ultimately, in a lot of instances, in order to get better, those analysts need to be given sufficient breathing room to take a step back, improve a process where that improvement might be initially slower, but would get them to a point that would be faster and more efficient eventually, right? Like the classic example that I use of this is like, there's a reason we don't we don't all use Dvorak keyboards, right? They are basically provably faster keyboard layouts, but it would take us all like learning and slowing down and typing slower for a while in order to to remap, all of our like body, physical memory, in order to type on that keyboard faster, which would
Yeah.
eventually happen. But the investment, the upfront investment is, difficult.
Yeah. I think the slight discrepancy there is in the sense of like, if that's a continual process, right?
Yep.
So,
Yeah, actually,
where
that's
they,
great.
they need to have that opportunity regularly, right? To be
Yep.
able to step back and be like instead of being in that tactical, like, in the weeds, just day to day, like, you have to be able to step back and say, okay, are we doing the thing that we should be doing, right? And
Yep.
how we're doing it. So,
Yeah. Well, and we've seen difficulty, we've had instances where analysts are like, "Hey, listen, I don't have time to learn this new tool." And
yep.
like ultimately we kind of have to be like, "Hey, listen, you don't have time not to," right?
Yeah.
Like
And
you're
helping them see
continuing
that
to.
is hard. So,
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, exactly. But like it requires being given sufficient breathing room to take a step back and not being like under the gun for like produce 10 reports a day or you're going to be fired. Right. And stuff like that, which like I've definitely, I mean, it's not exactly that severe, but I've seen organizations that are basically like, produce this much output, which also gets back to the metrics thing. All this shit is tied together, right? But ultimately, measuring the output of analysts is very, very difficult, right? If you say like X blogs per week or whatever, like, does it matter if they're high quality or low quality, if it's X assessments or threat clusters or malware families identified or whatever? Like, those are all pretty poor metrics. And so one of the things that we need to do eventually is, try to consider, are there better metrics that we could use in order to allow those analysts to be able to prioritize? But
yeah, actually, to go back to that, I don't know. I was just thinking about this, Visi, while you're talking. Do you think, like, we kind of bucket our customers, right? Most of our customers, right, where they have their teams, right, they are cost centers to their org, right? They are not producing, they have internal customers for the most part, things like that. Some of our customers, however, are revenue generating, right? And so it's interesting to see the discrepancies between how they approach their processes,
Yeah.
right? And I don't know if I'm trying to like kind of anecdotally think through them and whatnot as I'm sitting here.
Yeah, I think
Like,
I'm picking up where you're going.
yeah, I guess the question is how, do I think that they are actually aligned in that way? Are the people that are generating revenue given more opportunity to
I
essentially streamline? And I don't
I
know if
think
that's
that that's
true.
intuitively pleasing, but I think it's actually unfortunately not true. Like I think that there are organizations that, like, again, so this all leads back to a lot of extremely opinionated, perspectives that I have on things like hype cycles and market value and, revenue versus profitability and stuff like that. But ultimately, in a lot of instances, those organizations, the analysts are still under the gun to produce whatever X, pounds of intelligence feels like an A, kind of
Yeah.
things, because those are the sources of revenue. So if you've got, the ability to push button and produce 10 shitty reports, and you're being measured in how many reports you produce, right? And so, I mean, that was even a problem back in the government side, on the intelligence community side and stuff like that. They would measure, we had one organization that would measure their efficacy by the number of technical cables, essentially, or, technical writings that they wrote that were these, designed to be succinct. But in some instances, there wasn't enough happening for them to have that many to write. And so they started writing things about stuff that wasn't as important, which then degraded the signal to noise ratio and became a perverse incentive, where now the quality of their output on average was going down. And it was causing organizations to read their stuff less, even though they were then hitting the metrics of producing 10, whatever's a week. Right.
Yeah, which I think kind of just speaks to the general issue of you choose your metrics well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big time.
It's super important. Well, and
Yeah.
I think that's a fairly open field right now. I think that there are a lot of people doing some work, in the space, but I think that no one has landed on a really great answer yet. I think that that's one of the problems for the age, is essentially, how do we measure these Intel processes, in a way that that aligns correctly with their, like, impact. Right?
Do you have any thoughts on, like, the metrics that you feel would be better served than
They're pretty nebulous. Most of it, like, if I
Yeah.
had the answer, right, we'd have another company doing that. Um,
Yeah.
but essentially, I think that it needs to encompass multiple dimensions, right? It can't just be number of reports. It can't just be number of threat clusters. If you were to have it incorporate other dimensions, like at X quality or X caliber or X impact, right?
Mhm.
That might be more tenable. But I think that, the only real metric is outcomes, right?
Mhm.
And so, again, with that whole probabilistic model, right? And, like, I said maybe X will happen at X level of Y level of confidence, some kind of eventual mapping, but that also requires data volume, right? So
Yeah.
statistically significant samples of aligned, of, like, I said this and it happened or didn't happen, is also extremely difficult and resource intensive to produce. So,
And it would only be comparable within that org, right? Especially on the, like,
right.
for instance, even
Visibility
outcomes.
matters. Yeah.
Even outcome, I think, is difficult because what value does A outcome have versus B outcome, right? Like,
Right.
there's a value trade off. Like, what is the value difference? Are they exactly the same because there's one of each, right?
Right.
But if they're different
Yep.
outcomes, like, yeah. So
Well, and, this actually boils back to a little bit of why we've made Synapse, be extremely, like, flexible in the extreme, to the point where, like, if you just want a push button thing, like, this is not the answer, right?
yeah,
Mhm.
no.
We're not trying to be a tip. We're trying to be an actual, like, intelligence analysis workbench, and that means that everybody's workflow is going to be different. Everybody's data sources are going to be different, and everybody's, desirable outcomes are going to be different, right? Like, you might have an entire Intel team that is doing nothing but feeding context into the graph that then feeds, automated systems. And on the other end of the spectrum, you might have, other intelligence teams that are doing analysis that then results in, risk briefings to the protective services of VIPs, right? Like, and those are all intelligence processes, but they have pretty radically different outcomes and things like that. And so I think the real problem is, you might be able to design a decent metric for one org if you take an in-depth study perspective. But that doesn't scale. And so, that's sort of like the question of, like scale and general applicability versus specific
Yeah.
implementations, which
Yeah.
is a
Precision.
balance that we try to strike all the time. Like we're kind of faced with that as a challenge all the time. So
Yeah. The best we've done so far, I would say, is just provide the appropriate Legos for everybody to build their own.
100%.
Um,
Yep.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so like, just as as an example, right? Like there are instances where you could measure how many tags of a given type, a given team applies to a graph, right? And things like that to see trends in like, we're tagging more like this than this, or this team is, focused more on this aspect, right, of analysis than this other team and things like that. And that could be used to align or dare I say harmonize, right? Some of those teams, priorities and stuff like that. But ultimately, it's going to be on a per org basis.
Is there value in explicitly separating cyber data operations from intelligence analysts and analysis, do you think?
I think actually it's the opposite. I think there's value in integrating them, in
Okay.
having them more tightly coupled.
Can
And
you expand
so
on
like, yeah, so I mean essentially that's basic. Well, so in instances where legal allows it, right, and where it's useful for scope. But essentially having all of those teams like have access to data that's interdisciplinary, and maybe even see each other's assessments and things like that can be super valuable because that context might live, right down the hall from you, right, in that other analyst's head. And if you can't use it, if you can't discover it, right, via either automated processes or easy, kind of exploration, easy threat hunting or easy hunting processes, then you're going to miss it, right? And so I think that only the benefit of that is certainly multiplicative, right? And so I think that those processes being more tightly coupled rather than being more segmented is definitely valuable.
yeah. I think that one's pretty clear, I think. And I think, I guess to that end, right, would be to say, hey, um, the if they're separate, right, to your point, you can't see it. But then if you can't, the reason they're not together, right, is because there are certain things that maybe need to be separate. But I think as long as you have the right tools in place, right, that you can let them touch where they should be allowed. And
Right.
I think
Yeah.
that's
So
the
like as an example, right? We mentioned the potential for like HR use cases or things like that, or
sure.
financial fraud, right? Like there are certainly cases where like you need to take the subset of people that are directly involved in that, analysis, like effort, right, and have them be sort of sequestered where their work product isn't visible to everyone else yet, which is why we design views and layers, right? So that you can have like that subset of data that is only relevant to
Right.
my uh, case, right? My thing, my project that I'm researching, but has still the backing of all of that other data superimposed on top of it, or underneath it, actually, I suppose, so that you can see all that other context immediately, right? But
Yeah.
still have your little sandbox that you and the three people involved in a fraud investigation or whatever are the only ones who can see.
that? So I think I'll end on this question because we are looking at the past 10 years. What do you think is the best thing that has evolved for CTI in 10 years? And what do you think still needs to be improved upon?
Ooh, that's a good one.
The best thing that's evolved, like for the industry, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one. Glad
I
that's not
mean,
subjective.
am I allowed
Got
to
you
say
this trick
synapse?
with my gotcha journalism.
Yeah, we allowed to
Yeah,
say
am I
synapse.
allowed to say synapse?
I'm pretty sure we're not allowed to say synapse.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so ultimately, I think that one of the things that does appear to be making progress in the last 10 years, and it's slow, but, industries are slow to change, is that it does seem like people are beginning to understand that larger perspective that we need to have, right? We have seen customers and organizations that sort of started off with just the like IPs and indicators and threat clusters, adopt a larger strategy where they have engaged with other parts of their organization and carried things out and actually had high impact, results, right? And so that's been really, really good. And I think, like I said, it's been slow, but I think it's been happening. And I think that's honestly, I think that for the industry to survive, I think it's actually existential because the current, value proposition for CTI is insufficient. most of the time, a lot of, decision makers are like, I don't know what I can ask of these people, and I don't know what they're supposed to be doing, and I don't know the impact they have on my organization. And so I think that on the things that haven't changed side, I think that hasn't changed a lot yet. But I think we're also only just beginning to apply some of this like increased scope, increased impact. But the thing that I would encourage analysts to do, that I say all the time, right, is get involved in other use cases where you could be of benefit, right? Because those organizations that have then had the executive leadership have that dawning moment of realization where they realize that they could ask those people other things, or have them involved in other processes, they often end up doing things like not reorging them as frequently and giving them additional resources and things like that, because they see the value coming back. And I think that that's one of the things that's been slow to change in our community, is you've got people that are like, that's not my job, right? And like, well, it better be, or your job's not going to exist anymore.
Yeah, I think to your point about, I mean, I'm trying to think back, right? When we first started out, right? Like we'd have the conversation less, but we still have the conversation of why do we care? Right. But we definitely have it less than we used to. So I would agree that
Yeah.
that's certainly been helpful. There's less of a,
Oh yeah, that's a really good point.
right. Like we don't, like, why do we care at all about this? Like, why should
Yeah.
we care? So
Yeah.
I think that's been, I think that, I mean, I don't know if that's the best thing that's happened, but from
That's good though. Yeah.
my myopic perspective, right, of like trying to grow Synapse's use from a customer perspective, I would say that that's been something that we've definitely noticed, right? And we have more people, I would say, coming to us and asking questions that are not why do I care, but rather can you support this specific use case, right, or whatever. So.
Yeah, and that's actually been, honestly, that's been some of the most fun that we've had, right? Is customers that come in with this left field, like, this use case right out of left field, that it's like, could you add, like, I know you've got some physical objects in the model, like we need you to add trains, like actual train cars to the data model because intelligence reasons, right? And we're like, that sounds great, right? Awesome. And so then we end up doing a deep dive on the terminology in that discipline, right? And then end up implementing model elements that reflect that terminology. So the example that I always give is, do you know what a series of train cars actually linked together is called, right? Because everybody would call that a train, but like that term is ambiguous, right? And so like it turns out a series of train cars linked together into what we would call a train is actually called an extent in that space, in that field, right? And so the model has to incorporate terminology from those disciplines in order to accurately reflect those. So in any case, it's a fun side effect, but
So when I
we
play
get
Ticket
asked.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
I was just gonna say, so when I play Ticket to Ride and I connect all the trains together, that's an extent.
The trains that are connected together, the cars that are connected together into one contiguous thing that we would call a train is actually called an extent.
I think for Ticket to Ride, that would technically just be the route, right? Like that's the actual track.
Routes are a separate, the tracks, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Awesome.
we modeled that too because we had to, right? So
Right. Awesome. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners and viewers with before we exit today?
Like ultimately, keep increasing the scope. The higher visibility you have, the higher impact you have, the more resources you'll have. It's that simple.
Yeah. Like intelligence is famous for like being close hold. Don't do that if you don't have to.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Visi and Whippit, for being here today. I hope everyone will tune in to our next episode in this limited series, where I'll be joined by the analysts from the Vertex Project to discuss how analysts actually investigate. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you at the next episode.
Thanks, Callie. See ya.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Signals and Stories. If you found this episode useful, be sure to follow the series and share it with your team. For more on how the Vertex Project approaches intelligence, from data modeling to real investigations, visit vertex.link. We'll see you in the next episode.